Black infant mortality is 2.4 times that of white infant mortality. Black men and Mexican men with chest pain wait longer for an initial EKG than white men. Black men and Mexican men with long bone fractures wait longer for a smaller dose of pain medication. Black children with an appendicitis go with no pain medication at greater rates than white children with appendicitis. It's not ideas I'm talking about. This is flesh I'm talking about. I've always thought about race. I've always been interested in race, even as a child. And race can be understood in biological terms, in genetic terms. It could be social terms. People talk about race being invented in the 1600s to help with slavery. We don't even know what race is. I was a medical school professor on rounds with the residents and students, and one of the students said to me, we have a 3-year-old black child. You see, Dr. Garcia, you can have a black child with one black parent, and yet the child is still black. And I said, oh yeah, I know, we got one at the house. We have we have 3 now. They're here. I went to a meeting in New York. He said I'm a pediatrician. I am a pediatrician, but I don't practice anymore. I'm an executive. I sold out and went over to health insurance. I was at a meeting in New York near Madison Square Garden. Went to a building, 30-something floors. So got in the elevator in the morning on my way up. About halfway up, there's all these black women in the elevator. About halfway up, they start speaking Spanish to each other. And I said, you guys aren't black? I said, no, I'm Dominicana, I'm Puerto Riqueña. And after they all told me what they were, I said, I think we're related. One of them looked at me. I don't think so. We don't even know what race is. It's no wonder that we can't solve for race in medicine, health disparities in medicine, inequalities in medicine, because race is not a medical problem. This is an American problem. So I started thinking about race. I wanted to write a book. I had written some articles about race. What is it? What isn't it? I wrote my initial article was called The Misuse of Race in Medical Diagnosis, where we are taught in medical school, all medical schools, to say the age, the race, and the gender of the patient. And I always wondered, what difference does it make if this is a 40-year-old Hispanic with a twisted ankle or a 3-year-old Asian female with an earache? I didn't understand what race meant, and the answer was always the same. It was, well, Jews get Tay-Sachs and blacks get sickle cell. And I thought, there's not that much Tay-Sachs running around. So this is not really, we don't even, this is, so I challenge what is the value of race in medicine. And it occurred to me that we really need to include social sciences and humanities as we discuss race in medicine. And so I kind of had this floating around in my head. I went to Berkeley in the 1980s, and these are some of the classes I took. Sociology of race, Chicano politics, Chicanos in film, black child development. I wrote a midterm in black English. This is before the Ebonics plague. And I took a class, Black Women in Fiction from Slavery to the Harlem Renaissance, which I enjoyed so much. I took the second semester, Black Women in Fiction from the Harlem Renaissance to the present, that ended with Color Purple. I'll tell you how old I am. In addition to these classes, I did take the pre-med classes and went to medical school. In medical school, in addition to the ordinary medical curriculum, I listened to a lot of jazz. I listened to Miles Davis, Sarah Vaughan, Billie Holiday, the sort of standard stuff, and I fancied myself as a jazz fan. I started to read about jazz as well, and when you read about jazz, what becomes clear is that the soloist is supreme in jazz. So you have the soloist who plays in concert with the collective. So you'll have a saxophone player take a solo, then they come back to the group. Then you have pianists take a solo, and then the drummer and bassist. And sometimes those don't even sound like they're playing within the same piece. And then you're reminded when they come back that they are one collective. So the individual is supreme in jazz. And I thought this might be a way to think about race in medicine. So I thought I'd write a book. In keeping with my concept of interdisciplinarity, I thought, why don't I get some friends of mine from sociology and psychology, anthropology, English, classical rhetoric, communications. You can't turn them loose on the medicine, so I got a cardiologist, a vascular surgeon, a geriatrician, pediatrician. I got 2 medical school deans, and I was even able to get the Surgeon General, Richie Carmona, to write a blurb on the back of cover of this book. So I published this book on race and medicine. I wrote 5 of the chapters. My 11 friends wrote the other chapters. And I did a couple of things in this book. We did a couple of things. One, this is Joshua Redman, the saxophone player. This is what I was talking about. So Joshua Redman would take a solo, the bassist would take a solo, and so forth. And so I wanted to bring this interdisciplinarity into medicine and looking at race and health disparities. The usual suspects in this field, if you want to call it a field, are physicians writing to other physicians. Maybe public health will get involved. And when you do talk about interdisciplinarity, you're really sometimes bringing in social sciences, but rarely humanities. And I went to a couple of conferences where people bragged about interdisciplinarity. But you know how little children, when they're learning to share, they mean you share with them, right? And so it was hard for me to bring these groups together because the sociologists would criticize me for not being up on the latest sociological literature, and I didn't want to mention that she didn't know how to work a pediatric ventilator. So interdisciplinarity really is critical to what we were doing, so we get these other thoughts. The other thing I did was we wrote these in the personal essay form. So the usual suspects who look at ordinary medical discourse or medical literature write to themselves, for themselves. And I thought, why don't we write, I don't mean watered down, I mean literary essays along the lines of Richard Rodriguez, James Baldwin, Michel de Montaigne, the father of the essay, who in the 1500s asked himself a question: what do I know? So that's what we did. Those are the 2 new ideas that I brought to this field of health disparities and inequalities in medicine. I was a fan of jazz. I read about jazz. And when you read about jazz, you get to bebop. And bebop is very difficult for me. I never liked bebop. Listening to it, I didn't understand it. And as I read about jazz, it seemed so academic. And so you read about it as academic, and then you listen to it, and then you read about it. So I kind of went back and forth with bebop. Dissonance is the word in bebop. This clash, this tension, this irregularity, this discordance is not only part of bebop and accepted in bebop, it is required in bebop. The tension from one musician to the other, the tension from one note to the next note is required in bebop, and that actually makes the product better. I hate to call jazz a product. But this was what was on my mind, and this is what I was reading. And I thought about race and medicine and how I could approach health disparities with bebop in mind as a template for how to think. When you read about bebop, you have to confront Thelonious Monk. And so I went to iTunes, and I bought a 99-cent Thelonious Monk tune. And I didn't like it, I'll be honest with you. It was disturbing, distracting. These notes were sour, they were untimely, they were kind of coming in from the side. It sounded like some 7th graders in beginning band warming up. I really was disturbed by bebop. But the more I read about it, I realized that I have to contend with Thelonious Monk. And so I listened to this song, and I went through iTunes, and I picked one that I recognized from my old Sarah Vaughan days and Miles Davis days, Round Midnight. That's what was playing when I first came out. That was Miles Davis playing Round Midnight. So let me play just a little clip of Sarah Vaughan's version of Round Midnight. You heard Miles Davis as I walked out. It was very nice and pleasant and so forth. You've all heard this. Let me play a piece of Sarah Vaughan doing Round Midnight. And then I want to play some Monk. And I want you to focus on the dissonance that I'm talking about, the disturbing part that sounds like some beginning children warming up. So this is Sarah Vaughan.
It begins to tell around midnight. I do pretty well till after sundown. Supper time, I'm feeling sad, but it really gets bad around midnight.
Doesn't that sound nice? So I listened to Monk, And the first time I listened to it, I could not understand it, and I was bothered by it. I listened the second time, and I listened the third time. And as I studied Monk, as I said before, I watched some documentaries, and one of the interviewees on the documentary said about Monk, Monk played in Minton's, was a house pianist in Minton's Playhouse for 10 years. And the guy said, I knew guys who played the black keys, and I knew guys who played the white keys. Monk played in the cracks. And I thought, I don't even know what that means, but I like it. So I'm going to use that line. So with that in mind, let's listen to Monk. This is Round Midnight, the same two clips that you heard from Miles Davis and Sarah Vaughan. So I didn't like that at first. And now I struggle with the other versions of Round Midnight because this is how I came to Monk. I understood Monk's version of jazz, sort of coincident with how I even think about things. You guys can probably tell already because of the way this talk is going. So this is what I'm saying about how to think about healthcare inequalities based on race. Dissonance is required. The social scientists that I talked about, the humanities. I'll just give you a sample of what I mean. As I mentioned, I come from Stockton, California, the most miserable city in America, 2 out of 3 years on yahoo.com. These are not scientific studies, but it gives you some sense of where I come from. I come from the worst side of town, from one of the worst families on that side of town. My grandfather and all of his brothers went to prison. All of my uncles went to prison. My father, all of my cousins went to prison. I'm the only man in 3 generations of men who did not go to prison. Going to Berkeley, going to medical school, being a board-certified pediatrician, doing a TED Talk at Sage, that's not my success. I didn't go to jail. Yeah, let's have a round of applause. I never got applause for not going to jail. Just set the bar kind of low, right? So I met my father, my genetic father, 3 or 4 times my whole life. He was a jazz musician. He taught himself how to play the trumpet, never took a lesson in his life, from what I hear. He gave me a lesson in the 6th grade. One lesson at, I guess, his mother's house, which would be my grandmother, but I didn't see it that way. He gave me a lesson on how to play the trumpet. In the 7th grade, I was in beginning band. In the 8th grade, the next semester, I was a teacher moved me to intermediate band. And then the next semester, I moved to advanced band in 7th grade. In the 8th grade, I was in advanced band playing first chair trumpet. And then I quit in the 9th grade. I was scheduling. I don't know what happened. But I have some musical sensibility from those days. I have the social sciences and such that I mentioned from my college days. When I just wrote another book, a follow-up to my first book, and I just wrote another article. And I looked to Aristotle really as a mentor for how to think about writing. Aristotle talks about forensic discourse, persuasive discourse, where forensic discourse invites the audience to see things differently, better than before. So I looked at Aristotle's forensic rhetoric, and the best man at our wedding had a PhD in classical rhetoric from Berkeley. He'd tell you where Aristotle went wrong. He talked about the rhetorical triad, the speaker, speech, the audience, where the audience is the most important part of the rhetorical triad. People are worried about the speaker, what he's going to say, but really it's the audience that is most critical. And you know this about jazz. If you go to a jazz set on Friday night, it will necessarily sound different on Saturday night. That's part of jazz. That's what jazz requires. If you go to classical music, Friday night ought to sound just like Saturday night, and if it doesn't, the audience will recognize that. So I'm very vested in the audience. A month ago today, February 2nd, my most recent article was published called Diversity in Pediatrics, the Myth of Sisyphus. And as you recall, Sisyphus was cast down by the gods to roll this rock uphill. And it would roll back down, he'd roll it back up the mountain and roll it back down. And so I looked at this as an example for how to write. My last article talking about diversity. So my pediatrician, her father in 1918 went to a black college in Pennsylvania, then went to Howard Medical School, then moved to Bluefield, West Virginia to deliver medical care to an unserved area. My professor went to Fisk, then Howard, and then she moved to Chicago to deliver health care to underserved people in Chicago. I was her student. In an article recently, there was talk about diversity in healthcare and the requirement of diversity. And I thought, this is 2018. In 1918, 100 years ago, diversity was called for. And I'm all for diversity, don't misunderstand, but it's not enough. It's insufficient. If we needed diversity for 100 years and we still need it, it's not working. We need more. Fannie Lou Hamer, the great civil rights figure on her tombstone says, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." So this is the title of my next book, Sick and Tired, Race, Jazz, and Medicine, where I talk about Aristotle's deliberative discourse, and that is, let's negotiate some deal to improve things. That means the audience. So I'm very interested in the role of the audience, and where Montaigne in the 1500s asked himself, what do I know? I ask myself, and I'm asking you to ask yourself, what can I do? Thank you.